Well, we've been talking about drugs and how it's taken over our youth and what's happening in our country and, for that matter, all over the world. But has America lost the war on drugs? Who better to ask than Robert Mazur, the undercover agent who infiltrated Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel. And he is the author of his newest book called The Betrayal. Nice to have you with us, Robert.
Oh, thank you very much for inviting me.
So how long were you undercover?
A total of 5 years.
5 years.
In two operations. The first was inside Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel for about 2 years, and then a little more than 2 years within the KAHI cartel and Panamanian underworld.
Now, being an undercover agent, you have to live that life, right?
Well, certainly you have to come across believably. So, yeah, part of it is living that life. Yeah.
So, you said that heroin was, let's see. You said information was your heroin. What do you mean?
Well, a lot of people ask me what motivated me to do long-term undercover, and some people get a little distracted by the thought of, well, gee, I can imagine that was very mesmerizing to be in $1,000 a night hotels and eat at the best restaurants in the world and have a private jet and all those other good things. But for me, those were props. I was completely motivated by whether or not I could get the next biggest piece of information that nobody else could get that was actionable for my agency. As an example, in 5 or 6 conversations, in one instance, I got enough information for us to seize more than a ton of cocaine in a warehouse in downtown Manhattan and arrest the major person who was responsible for getting it there. I dealt with people who were financial advisors for corrupt world leaders and got information about their secret financial affairs and all types of information about the generation of $160 million a month in 8 cities by just one cell of the Medellin cartel. So it really got to the point for me that if the next piece of information I didn't get that I got wasn't more impactful than the one before, I felt as though that I wasn't accomplishing my mission. And I can see now, reflecting upon it decades later, that as I continued in my undercover work, I began to take risks that probably now I wouldn't have taken, but I felt they were necessary at the time just to get some more of that heroin, to get more of that information nobody else could get.
We have been talking. Now, I've been doing talk shows for a very long time, Robert. And I remember when I first started out, over 40 years ago, we were talking about the battle against drugs. Just say no. Remember during the Reagan administration. But people are not saying no. Have we made any headway?
Well, I hate to admit it, but there's more drugs on the street now than there ever was. That's not to say that it isn't important. It is very much. It's very important for us to continue to attempt to cut the heads of the snakes off. The problem we face is that the illicit drug business is so profitable that we are not going to make major progress by simply fighting it aggressively on the supply side. We are, in my view, woefully weak in fighting it on the demand side. And in my view, there are three legs to the stool on the demand side. One, the first two are very obvious. The education to our youth and our adults about the ills of illicit drugs and how slippery a slope that is. And secondly, providing drug treatment to those who are sick and are drug users. But thirdly, I think the one thing that I think we fail miserably on is to recognize that there are segments of our societies in various cities that are underserved, underprivileged, have far less education and employment opportunity than most average Americans have. And unless and until we take a different approach with respect to educating our youth I just don't see this changing. My mom and dad were born in the early 1920s, 100 years ago. And so they had the opportunity for free education through high school. Here we are 100 years later, and that's what's being provided to the general public. And I just believe that there are people who have tremendous potential that never get the opportunity to realize that potential because they are so underserved and underprivileged. I think at least 2 years past high school for either college or trade school. And for those that excel, there should be an option for 2 more years. There is no better investment we can make in this nation.
And for the government to pay for that?
Well, there are a lot of ways for the government to be able to pay for that. Now, let's take, for example, the banks that have admitted in either being convicted or pleading guilty to illicitly conducting transactions to hide criminal activity. There are probably, I think I name about 18 of them in my book, The Betrayal. They collectively paid a fine of $24 billion. If we had invested $6,000 a year of that money toward each underserved, underprivileged kid, that would have been 4 million kids who would have gotten a year of college. It takes some states as much as $67,000 a year to maintain a prisoner in federal custody. I'd rather spend $6,000 a year at a much earlier age, helping to educate that person and making a productive person within our country, who then have families and become productive people within our country. We unfortunately, as a nation, think that we should be able to find the answer to something at a snap of a finger. The computer has probably contributed to that quite a bit.
Yeah.
But there is no easy answer. There is no silver bullet to this problem that has been evolving for 40 to 50 years. And the only way that we can do something significant, in my view, is to recognize that there is no short term. It's going to take 2 generations in order to be able to turn this around. And that's going to be with a dedication of trying to find the money to be able to deal with the issues that I've just made reference to. I have 2 cousins who died of overdoses of heroin.
Oh, boy.
And 1 more who came very close to dying of an overdose of heroin. I saw them as people who were sick.
Well, now, were they part of this segment of underprivileged?
No. Well, in a sense, yes. When I take a very close look at their lives, there were a lot of. They certainly were living below the norm economically, and had a very disrupted family life. But I'm not suggesting that there aren't drug addicts in the wealthy segments of our society.
Yeah, heroin moved to the suburbs.
And they make those decisions consciously. They make those decisions. They took that first
That's right.
because they wanted to get high. There are people, and to give you, I'll have to take this story outside of the United States. Things that our population has trouble wrapping their heads around. We get into political arguments about why there are so many migrants trying to get into the United States. And let's take the country of Honduras. It took 10 years for the Drug Enforcement Administration to carry out a plan that ended with, just this year, the extradition and imprisonment of the president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez.
Mm-hmm.
We have a room full of politicians from Honduras, corrupt military, corrupt police. And you might say, well, why did we care about that on our streets? Number one, they were bought by the cartels and were a major transshipment point for bringing in tons of poison into the United States. But secondly, the disruption of integrity and the rule of law in Honduras and it's being run by a bunch of renegades, creates a national security interest for our nation.
But how do we change that? That's not our country.
There's a lot more complexity to
but we have no
war on drugs.
How do we make changes in another person, another place, another world? It's another world. It's not ours, and we have no control over it.
We have to recognize that. Well, first of all, we attempt to have control over it in many ways
by pouring money in that never makes it to the people.
We do give foreign aid to these nations, but when their president takes that foreign aid and through cronies puts it in their pockets and never does a thing for the people who are there.
So why are we still doing it?
What?
Why are we still pouring money into that doesn't go to the people?
We didn't continue to do that. What we wound up doing is we wound up taking out that entire administration and making an opportunity for the rule of law to be able to regrow in that nation. And why does that matter to us? It matters to us because the people who were otherwise attempting to live normal lives in Honduras, picture this. You're at home with your family, and the door gets knocked on. And it happens to be some people from the gang MS-13. And they say to you, you know what? Your 13-year-old son is now our property. He's going to be working for us. And if that doesn't happen, we'll kill you, we'll kill your wife, we'll kill all your other kids.
Mm-hmm.
So now you're going to wind up continuing to live in that environment? No. What you're probably going to do is you're probably going to start walking north, and you're probably going to try to come into the United States. And again, it impacts us.
Yeah.
It impacts us because of immigration, and it impacts us because those other nations, when they are corrupted, bring so much bad drugs into our country. It is a domino effect. We are not in an isolation in a capsule where we can attempt to control our existence without taking into consideration what's going on in other parts of the world. It's like trying to suggest that there's no reason to believe that gas prices have gone up because the Russian oil has been taken, for the most part, off the market. Obviously, we're in a global world.
Yeah.
And what we need to recognize is that these criminal organizations in many, many different parts of the world, the Mexican cartels, the Colombian cartels, and now Hezbollah, the terrorist group, are working closely together with the Chinese triad. They are a massive threat to us because they bring into our hemisphere chemicals from the unregulated pharmaceutical companies in China, which
But Robert, you take out one regime and it gets replaced.
Well, you know what? You can sit back and not do anything. That would be like saying, you know what? Cancer's a terrible, terrible thing. We can't do anything about it. If you get cancer, you're just going to die. We're not going to try to do anything to come up with what we have chased for decades upon decades in an effort to try to control the pain and suffering that people who contract cancer deal with. We may never win that war, but God, I surely hope we never stop fighting it.
Yeah,
and
I absolutely agree with you. But I mean, yeah, we took out Pablo Escobar, but they're lining up behind him, right?
That's right, and that's why, when I was working within the underworld, one of the things that the cartel leaders used to jokingly say was, you know what, there'd be no supply if there was no demand.
That's right.
And there's a lot to be said for that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right. So, we have to look at our house.
Big time. But how do we stop it here?
How are we attempting to try to diminish the demand for illicit drugs? And I don't think we're putting in nearly the resources that we need to. And we can find ways to be able to pay for that when we recognize that there are sources of revenue that we can tap into. But my example was $24 billion in fines to banks that were laundering.
But people will do what they want to do. You cannot make them go into education. You cannot make them take the treatment.
Well, I
disagree
with you. I do believe that you can open people's eyes to opportunities and change minds with education. I do believe
I don't know if that's true or not. Well, we've had so much education. We've had so many, sayings and, stay away. We've had the videos. We've had the people who had drugs, and they go and talk to the kids. Does anybody listen?
Going and talk to kids who are living in a home in the midst of a war on their streets isn't going to solve the problem. In my view, and we may never come to an agreement on this, but I'm so happy that we can at least share our mutual thoughts. I honestly do believe that there are people, regardless of the color of their skin, they could be in Kentucky up in the hills and not be able to get the education that people might be able to get on the west side of Manhattan. But there are fundamental responsibilities that societies have to try to make education more broadly available.
Okay, now define education for me, please.
Education, yeah. After high school, what are you going to do? Well, if you're not going to go to college, maybe you want to learn a trade.
There you go.
You should be able to get the opportunity.
We used to have vocation in high schools. That's all gone.
No, but, that's not going to get you a job. I mean, in vocation, I used to go to wood shop and I'd make a lamp. That's not what I'm talking about.
No.
I'm talking about going to a trade school and learning to become a welder. I'm talking about being able to be a productive person within our economic system, holding down a decent-paying job.
Hey, decent paying? They make more than I do.
They
They're
certainly
good.
do. They can make more than $100,000, $150,000 a year.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have enough of them, and so they're working 12-hour shifts, and it is creating, I hate to say it, it's creating a drug problem within that profession.
Wow.
I know that for a fact. I happen to know a couple of young men who have just completed training and are involved in welding in the oil refinery business. And
they're on drugs?
That is becoming a problem. But regardless, I just do believe that if you think that we have done our country a service by what we've done thus far with respect to a very, very sophisticated adversary, a very sophisticated adversary in the organized criminal groups around the world, then I've got a bridge in Brooklyn that I can sell.
Yeah. No, it's not. It's worse now than ever.
It is worse now than ever, and so therefore that should be the light bulb that goes off in one's head that says, how can we do things differently to try to get a better outcome? I just don't. I'm not willing to just give up.
Yeah, I agree with you. There has to be something. You got to start someplace. I understand that. But I mean, when the streets are running rampant with fentanyl, which is killing people. I mean, how do we get that message over? Don't do this because it could be a synthetic drug.
Do you know how the fentanyl problem got to be where it is?
No.
The fentanyl problem got to be where it is the story that starts at least 10 to 15 years before, when the pharmaceutical companies in the United States lied to the American public, lied to the FDA, and claimed that OxyContin, an opioid, could not be compromised for one to get high, and it was the best painkiller that everybody should use.
Mm-hmm.
And then they started making kickbacks to doctors and people who ran pill mills, and they pumped as much OxyContin on the streets of the United States that they possibly could. It, in effect, became a legalization of opioids. They were that readily available everywhere. And they were readily available there because of the greed of the corporate executives in those pharmaceutical companies, the greed of the doctors, the greed of the people who were involved in the pharmacies that were distributing 10 times the amount of opioids that any reasonable mind could ever imagine. And once the Drug Enforcement Administration tried to get that problem under control and started shutting down the pill mills, the cartels recognized, okay, we can fill this with heroin, but wait a minute, we can even fill it better. We can go to China and we can get those chemicals necessary to make fentanyl, to make methamphetamine, and then we can bring that in. Well, you know what? The demand was not created by those cartels. The demand was created by the U.S. pharmaceutical companies
But let me ask you a question, though, Robert. Let me ask you a question. You have two cousins who died because of drugs. Did you ever want to do drugs? I mean, you were an undercover agent, so obviously you were exposed to it. Did you ever have the desire to take a drug?
No, not.
And why? Why not?
Well, because of my life experiences. I had a very good education. I had very good parents who helped me and guided me through my life. And I think I had a tremendous advantage to having had that experience. Not everyone does. Not everyone does. And I'm not suggesting that, if everyone gets education to the point where they have productive employment and don't have to suffer in poverty, that there's not going to be a drug problem. That's not the point whatsoever.
That's true.
The point is that there are a lot of people who live a day-to-day existence and see that there's no way out. And the way that they escape is that they begin to abuse illegal drugs.
But some do make it out. Why do they make it out and these others don't?
Yeah, well, there are success stories are far, far fewer than horror stories.
Yeah, but why don't we go after the success stories and find out what happened for them? I mean, why?
Well, we do know what happens with them. They get an education.
I don't know if education's the only thing to do, because there's a lot of drugs on campuses too.
Yes, there are a lot of drugs on campuses, and not every single student winds up using them.
Exactly.
But, it's hard for us to put ourselves in a position without maybe living that life for a little bit, walking in somebody else's shoes. Having been a cop and having been a person who worked in those areas, I mean, I think I've had the opportunity to see what life in some of those parts of the underserved and underprivileged communities are, and it's hell.
Yeah. But, people grow up in difficult situations. I mean, I was raised in the south side of Chicago. It was not real pleasant and was not easy, to maintain or to get out. But the desire was always there. How do we get that desire in these young people to want to get out and to get that education?
By making it affordable.
If you really want something enough, you will find a way. Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I understand and I hear what you're saying. I just don't share that view. I do believe that there are...
I mean, I had no money when I went to college because my dad had an accident. I had to find my own way. Now, obviously, I worked hard in high school to get good grades, but I don't know how we promote that to young people. I don't know. Some make it and some don't, and you have to wonder why.
Yeah, well, somebody better start thinking about different ways. Start thinking outside the box, because what we've been doing inside the box
it ain't working. Yeah.
It's not working.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So it's easy to say that we can't do anything differently, but then that's surrendering.
Agreed.
Yeah.
So where do there's got to be a starting point. What's the starting point?
The starting point is to establish, well, first of all, there is no, I think I told you this before, there's no silver bullet. This has got to be all part of a program.
And like you said, it's going to take a couple of generations.
Fighting the supply side, that needs to continue to be done. There are some things that we're not doing right there. On the supply side, we need to go after the people that are at the highest levels of the drug trafficking world. That does not happen all the time.
Why?
By any means. Because agencies are evaluated based upon the numbers of arrests and seizures that they make. And when Congress, who sometimes are not motivated enough to look behind the numbers and simply go, well, how many arrests and seizures were made? Oh, wow, look at this. The numbers are way down. I can't count the number of times that about a month before the end of the fiscal year, which ends in October for the federal government, in September, if the numbers were down, a boss would come in and tell the group, listen, you need to get with the local law enforcement agencies and adopt as many cases that you possibly can from them, because we need to get the arrest numbers up, because we're going to have that in order to be able to argue for an increased budget. Well, now what you do is you take a bunch of local cases and people who probably don't deserve to wind up for extended periods of time in federal prisons, and they do. And they do because of the statistical needs on the supply side. I mean, we could go over a dozen or more different, even more than a dozen. And unfortunately, we've run out of time. Do you have a website? Yes, it's Robert at Mazur, Mazur.com. Terrific. And the book, The Betrayal, available where? Amazon.com, all major distributors, and it is in the process of being developed as a film sequel. Fantastic. For the Infiltrator film. Bryan Cranston has publicly proclaimed he is anxious to play me again, but this time in the Betrayal film, and we're looking forward to developing that. We're in the process of trying to perfect the screenplay. Well, keep me posted, because I want to let people know, okay? Oh, I'd love that. That would be great. Well, you know how to get a hold of me, Robert, anytime, and we'll keep plugging. That's the main thing we have to do. And okay. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. That's my pleasure. Take care now. Thank you. And happy holidays. You too. Once again, Robert Mazur, Mazur. The book is called The Betrayal, and coming out as a movie that, what a life he's had, and trying to help others to get out of that life. Anyway.